Quand j'ai commencé à étudier l'histoire de la peinture, et surtout la peinture moderne, on m'a toujours raconté la même histoire. On m'a dit que l'art moderne avait commencé avec Monet et les impressionnistes, et que la capitale de l'art moderne, où on l'avait inventé et développé, était Paris. Since then, I found out that that was a lie. Modern painting wasn't invented in France. Its origins don't lie in Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, or any other Parisianism.
Modern painting was invented in Britain in the first half of the 19th century. John Constable and J.M.W. Turner were the Darwin and Einstein of 19th century art. The painters who broke more radically with the conventions of the past than any of their contemporaries and any to have come after them. Yet because we, the British people, have been so reluctant to recognise their greatness, the magnitude of their achievement has been shamefully obscured. This is their story. But it begins with the wrong man, in the wrong time, in the wrong place. James Barrie spent 7 years working unpaid on what he hoped would be his masterpiece, here at the RSA, close to the Strand in central London. Barrie, an ambitious young Irish painter, came to London in 1771. Like many others of the time, he wanted to break out of the narrow confines of British taste. But unlike artists such as Reynolds and Gainsborough, who'd smuggled their great ambitions into portraiture, Barrie absolutely refused to compromise. He was a new kind of artist, a man who painted only for himself, and, he hoped, for posterity. He called his great work The Progress of Human Culture, and it's remained virtually unknown for nearly 2 centuries. Barrie had been to Rome as a young man, and this was to be Britain's answer to the Italian Renaissance. Its subject was nothing less than the history of the world, told in 6 oil paintings.
Although it looks so obviously over its shoulder at the art of the past, Barrie's painting does represent a first faltering step towards modern painting. Barrie's contribution to British art was a whole new idea of what the artist could be, someone determined to pursue their own personal vision, no matter where it might lead them.
His great scheme starts in the mists of time and moves on, conveniently skipping 2,000 years of history, straight into the late 18th century, where we see the great and the good of Georgian society. Its climax is a panorama of heaven and hell, where heaven, as is often the case in paintings of the Last Judgment, looks like rather a dull place. But the seething pit of hell below has been painted with altogether more gusto and panache. The corrupt politician, the slanderer, the dishonest picture dealer. Barrie hugely enjoyed casting these people into eternal damnation, and he did it with a pictorial vigour almost worthy of the great Baroque master Peter Paul Rubens. But that's a big almost. Sadly, the truth about Barrie's attempted masterpiece is that it didn't quite work. It's a rather sickly mixture of allegory, portraiture, and pastiche. It's full of unconvincing figures. A water nymph like an inflatable woman. A Greek philosopher with an unusually enlarged brain. Barrie's included his own self-portrait, and he's given himself a martyred, long-suffering expression. For good reason. His Herculean effort received little more than a lukewarm response. Barrie became severely paranoid and withdrew from the world. In all but talent, he was the very model of the mad modern artist, a visionary who suffered in pain and neglect for the glory of his art, a man condemned to live out his life on the fringes of society. I think the late 18th century was a completely fascinating period, because it was a time when all established beliefs were being overturned.
In France and America there was political revolution, but in Britain there was revolution at the level of culture and art, a revolution which might not have changed society as visibly as the events in Paris of 1789, but which did so just as profoundly, because it changed the way in which people saw, thought and felt.
James Barrie was just one of a large number of British writers and intellectuals who took revolution as the model for their own activities. Thomas Paine published The Rights of Man. William Godwin published Political Justice. And Godwin's wife, Mary Wollstonecraft, published the mother text of modern feminism, a vindication of the rights of woman. The artist William Blake, poet, publisher and printmaker, was a man at the very centre of this group of London radicals and dissenters. Blake had hero-worshipped Barrie, and like him he was an insurrectionist at heart. But unlike him, Blake was a brilliantly original thinker and artist.
Blake never worked on anything like the same scale as Barrie, and most of his pictures take the form of illustrations to the books of poetry, which he wrote, engraved and coloured entirely by hand. He published them in tiny editions, and copies are extremely rare, but they're really the best way to get inside Blake's imagination.
He spent his life dreaming up a world, shaping his thoughts and energies into mysterious but vibrant images. He was passionately unorthodox and didn't really think of himself as an artist, but an unruly modern druid. Most forms of established order were anathema to him, but above all, established religion. He saw the Pope as a fat vampire feeding on human weakness. Blake's art was a cry for freedom from all forms of political or mental servitude. This wonderful illustration to Dante's Divine Comedy is supposed to be an image of lost souls trapped in purgatory. But I think of it as Blake's way of depicting his own exuberant delight in unconstrained, eternal energy. This figure, called Glad Day, was described by Blake as the spirit of 1789. It's full of the gentle, idealistic optimism with which the English radicals first greeted the news from France. It's the equivalent to Wordsworth's lines about the start of the Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven.
It's in Blake's books that this love of liberty is most clearly expressed. It's there at the level of their very form. As he engraved his own words, Blake turned them into shapes like wispy foliage or tendrils. It's as if text itself has somehow been freed from the tyranny of a typeface and begun to metamorphose into something wilder and more organic.
The British have been happier with words than images, but Blake stood that on its head. His spidery handwriting was really just another form of painting. Like many revolutionaries, Blake also yearned for law and order. In his case, that need expressed itself in a lifelong quest for God.
When he was a young man, Blake was hired to make precise drawings of the tombs here in Westminster Abbey. They clearly had a profound effect on him. His own art would be full of curious, gothically stiff figures drawn to resemble stone effigies.
This peaceful imagery represents the other side of Blake, not an art pulling restlessly towards some revolutionary future, but one harking back to the religious certainties of what Blake saw as a purer and more devout age. In exploring this fantasy of returning to the Middle Ages, Blake anticipated a whole generation of Victorian artists and architects. And I think the paradox of Blake's life was that this self-confessed rebel should have had such a deep-seated need for some form of external spiritual authority. Occasionally, as in this delicate watercolour of a pair of angels, their wings touching to form a Gothic arch, Blake does genuinely seem to have found the faith and tranquillity he was looking for. But more often, there's an anxious tinge to his work. Blake claimed that he actually saw many of the supernatural creatures he depicted in his art. This, he said, was the man who came to see him in his dreams and taught him how to paint. And this peculiar creature was the ghost of a flea, which he drew one day to prove to some doubting Thomas that he really did see visions. I think Blake was a bit of a fraud, but I also think this rather cheap, fairground spiritualist act that he went in for is rather revealing. I think he was trying to fool himself as well as everyone else. Deep down, he was terrified that there were no guardian angels, and that he was living in a world that had been abandoned by God. In the 1760s and 70s, Joseph Wright of Derby had painted a series of pictures of scientific experiments. This painting, an experiment on a bird in an air pump, hangs in the National Gallery. When Wright painted it, it was still just possible to see science as the handmaiden of religious belief. The scene is charged with a sense of hushed expectancy, and lit by an intense, otherworldly light, an effect borrowed from Baroque altarpieces. Wright certainly meant his picture to prompt reflections on God's benevolence, his gift of oxygen, and with it life. The lecturer who's about to release the stopcock on the air pump has been made to resemble God the Father. The bird about to be saved has been made to resemble the dove of the Holy Spirit. When I look at this picture, I see the age of faith turning into the age of reason, and I see the ideas of a new age sucking the air out of religious belief. Once that's happened, what's left? Wright shows us in this self-portrait only the questioning, doubting, troubled individual. The self was one of the great subjects of the period. More self-portraits were painted at this time than ever before. This was a generation obsessed by its reflection in the mirror. This self-portrait by Samuel Palmer is one of the most brilliant of all 19th century pictures. To be an artist is to be the most special type of person, this picture says. Palmer's fixed, almost hypnotic stare also shows us that a whole new order of consciousness came into being during this time. A new, rather lonely, and definitely egocentric sense of self-awareness.
The age of introspection also produced an architecture of introspection, and this is its masterpiece, Sir John Soane's museum.
On the outside, Soane's home here in Lincoln's Inn Fields seems fairly conventional. But on the inside, there's some of the most extraordinary and inventive use of space to be found anywhere in European domestic architecture. Soane was a great collector and hoarder, and this is his art gallery. With its walls that fold out like pages, it's a cross between a room and a scrapbook. I've always wondered why it never caught on with more people. It's such an obviously brilliant solution to the problem of owning too many pictures and not having enough walls. As chief architect to the Bank of England, Soane was a pillar of the establishment, a man at the heart of British trade and empire. But inside his own deeply unconventional home, he created a cave, a grotto dedicated to the self, its loves, and its preoccupations. It's the strangest and the most haunting building I know. This is architecture as self-portraiture, a house that feels like the model of a mind. Visiting the house is literally like taking a tour through the various compartments of someone's brain, or walking through their moods. Upstairs, there's a sense of clarity and enlightenment. This is a place literally dedicated to light. Its colour, which Soane is said to have borrowed from the palette of his friend, the painter Turner, is the colour of the sun. Soane was fascinated by the play of light, and his house is full of these convex mirrors, which he used to catch and reflect it. But as you descend into the basement, the mood turns altogether more sinister. Down here, Soane gave full rein to the darker aspects of his mind, filling the space with ghoulish objects. The basement of the house is also its subconscious. There's an element of playful Gothic horror here, the same flirtation with old fears and superstitions which would produce Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, and, eventually, that other great British cultural institution, the Hammer horror film. But it's not just a game when you unchain the demons of the mind.
Imagination unleashed, freed from the checks and controls of rational thought, produces all kinds of freaks. The sleep of reason breeds monsters.
This rather murky image of demonic possession is called the nightmare, and it prompted the writer William Hazlitt to dub Henry Fuseli, who painted it, a nightmare on the breast of British art. Fuseli, a Swiss émigré, was the acknowledged master of this vein of deliberately shocking and often erotically charged fantasy. Although he was an unlikely choice as R.A. Professor of Painting, being a man with pronounced sadomasochistic tendencies and a rather dubious oil painting technique, Fuseli was only giving extreme expression to a widespread spirit of louche and wild imagining present in Britain at the time. It infected almost all forms of art and writing, and it's there at its most extreme, I think, in the work of Gilray.
James Gilray has been remembered as a caricaturist, but he's another obsessive excavator of the self. His caricatures are attempts to imagine what people might look like if their inner selves were actually written on their faces.
In Gilray's world, satire, that old British staple, became proto-surrealism. More truly disturbing than the 20th century version, because so completely unconstrained. At this moment in history, the human imagination opened up like a Pandora's box to release buzzing swarms of new and weird imagery.
English writers had also been finding ingenious new ways to picture the self, and I do mean picture, because these are essentially visual inventions. I'm thinking in particular of the extraordinary black page, which Lawrence Sterne included in his novel Tristram Shandy, to suggest a black state of mind, and also of the disordered typography in Samuel Richardson's great novel Clarissa, which he meant as a metaphor for his heroine's mental turmoil after she'd been raped.
You can see this enormous transformation of human priorities most clearly in the way Soane arranged his hoard of objects. Ever since the Renaissance, the act of collecting, ordering and collating the relics of the past had been a hallmark of the rational, objective intellect. But the sheer giddy profusion of objects in this place doesn't tell me about ancient Greek or Roman culture. It tells me about the obsessiveness of John Soane. The entire house is a fabulous construct of the self, an almost Dadaist assemblage of objects, which looks forward to our own century. Soane was the first man to build this kind of memorial to his own personality. In this building, the world of the it is became the world of the I am. This is Dedham Vale in Suffolk, a place immortalised on several million tea towels and chocolate boxes as Constable country. Every summer, this landscape becomes the focus of a ritual, devoutly performed by thousands of day-tripping visitors. What brings people here is a powerful nostalgia for a largely imaginary past. What's being venerated is the ideal of a pastoral England, lush, unspoiled, unpolluted. A place where the sun always shines, and where there's always time for tea and scones.
Constable, who put Dedham Vale on the map, has now become almost irrelevant to its popularity. It's as if his art has come to be seen as a poor substitute for the countryside itself. After all, why settle for an image when you can visit the reality?
As far as I'm concerned, this is the real Constable country. Not fields of grass, but fields of paint. Paint handled with a fierce, expressive energy. This is the world of the I am, expressed in art. Constable's The Haywain is a national institution, but like many celebrated pictures, it's been obscured by its fame. It might be difficult to imagine now, but when Constable painted it in 1821, this picture was a manifesto for change and a statement of subversive intent.
At the time, only narrative pictures were generally painted to such large, assuming dimensions. Only paintings of subjects drawn from the Bible or mythology were considered important enough to warrant this scale.
But Constable ripped up that ancient gentleman's agreement about what was or wasn't significant subject matter for high art. By painting this picture so big, he dared to suggest that the most ordinary subjects might also be the most profound ones. Much later in the 19th century, the French artist Paul Cézanne laid down exactly the same challenge. "I want to stun Paris with an apple," he said. Constable, who'd exhibited the Haywain in France to great acclaim, had already done so with a horse and cart. He didn't just revolutionise landscape painting, but the very concept of landscape itself. The first truly gifted British landscape painter, Richard Wilson, had depicted the estates of the 18th century aristocracy, making them look fashionably Italian, like the Roman Campagna. But Constable completely turned his back on this type of landscape art painted in a borrowed style. His style was his own, and the landscape he painted was, in his words, my place. Dedham Vale was as important to Constable as the Lake District was to Wordsworth. Not just his subject, but the focus of his life. This proprietorial sense of place was something quite new. He often saw and painted Dedham Vale in a religious light, as if the sunny valley ringed by canals had become in his mind's eye his own personal Garden of Eden. There are often little hints or echoes of the Bible in his pictures. This image of a boat under construction always reminds me of Noah building the ark, right here in holy Suffolk. Constable's small oils, such as this little picture of Flatford Mill from the Lock of 1811, contain many of his greatest innovations. They're among the freshest and most original 19th century pictures, full of inventive strokes of shorthand for nature on the wing. There were lots of useful pointers here for that much later school, the French Impressionists. In Constable's cloud studies, the texture of painted skies comes to seem like a distillation of the texture of thought itself, a space where truant shapes wander and chase each other, like ideas or feelings. These pictures are usually referred to as sketches, but Constable was one of the first artists to call into question the very idea of making hard and fast distinctions between preparatory and finished work. These scraps of painted board take us to the heart of a volatile moment in the history of art, when painters placed such a high value on the rough edges of their work that even they themselves began to get confused about the difference between their so-called sketches and their so-called exhibition pictures. Here, in the Royal Academy, there's one of Constable's finest works. It's called The Leaping Horse, and as far as Constable was concerned, this was definitely a finished exhibition picture. It's alive with the glitter of light on water and foliage. Constable actually described painting as a form of thanksgiving, and he lightly dedicated the picture to God by including this little church. This is the masterpiece of Constable's public personality, the epitome of what he said he was trying to do in his art. But Constable's vivid, free style of painting could also pull him in another direction. The painted hymn to nature could easily turn into something else. Not a picture that looks out and up to God, but a darker, more troubling kind of picture. This kind of picture. This is the oil sketch for The Leaping Horse, or at least that's how Constable always described it. I think it disturbed him so much that he felt he had to demote it to the level of a study. Still, he valued it enough to keep it all his life, and that fact may tell its own story.
As Constable grew older, his passions worked themselves more and more deeply into his work. Painting is another word for feeling, he said, and this picture is, for me, the most nakedly emotional of all his works. It's also, I think, the masterpiece of his life.
This is one of those rare paintings where we can see an artist realise the deepest implications of his work at a single stroke. The technique devised to represent nature speaks more here of internal than external reality. Constable paints not only what he sees, but what he feels. I don't know what Constable's feelings were exactly for the landscape of his youth as he set about this great brute of a picture. Loss? Love? Melancholy? It's impossible to say. But a great surge of inexplicable emotion has whipped the paint up into a sort of frenzy. The continuous surface, the smooth skin of a painted illusion, for so many centuries the ideal of painting, has suddenly been shattered. Paint has become like a liquid emission of excitement, so that the surface of the canvas is literally covered with a screen of white flecks. Constable, who knew that the technique had become his signature, called this effect "my snow." In painting his picture, Constable put a great truth into the very texture of art. This way of painting says that we can only know the world subjectively, through the screen of our own thoughts and memories and emotions. Constable's snow represents all that clouds human experience and all that makes every experience a personal one. This was the new order of self-consciousness, turned into paint itself.
There had been painters in the past who disturbed the surface of the illusion with rough, blatant brushstrokes, in particular Titian and Rembrandt in their old age, but never had the surface of the picture been broken into anything like this welter of discontinuous marks.
The extreme brokenness of Constable's technique looked forward, not back. It anticipated that whole strand of self-expressive art, which would be wound to its most adventurous conclusion in the loops and coils of paint spun across his canvases by Jackson Pollock in New York in the 1950s. But it's time now to look at the very greatest British artist of all. His name was Joseph Turner. His way of seeing changed the very act of seeing itself.
Claude Monet painted this picture of the water lilies in his pond at Giverny when he was an old man, nearly 70 years after Turner's death. When I think of him painting it, I see someone forever haunted by the beauty and the evanescence of the effects of light on water conjured by Turner in his art, and haunted too by the knowledge that those effects are quite simply beyond him. I think Monet was a wonderful artist in his own right, and I don't say this to put him down or to bang some jingoistic drum on behalf of British art, but the fact is that his painting, and indeed a whole strain of modern art in which light and colour have been set free, none of that would have been possible without the revolution in painting brought about by Turner, and that fact has been forgotten, or at least obscured, for too long.
Like Constable, Turner changed the shape of painting. But unlike Constable, and so many members of his uneasy generation, Turner eventually managed to burst through doubt and anxiety. But it was to be a tremendous struggle. He was the son of a barber, and he was never entirely comfortable in the company of connoisseurs or his fellow Royal Academicians. He was a very insecure man, and for much of his life he painted as if he didn't really believe that he himself could ever be a great artist. He painted endless tributes to the old masters, like this homage to the 16th century Italian painter Raphael and all his works. He imitated Dutch 17th century painters of maritime scenes. He had a huge, almost too huge, respect for artistic tradition. He's said to have burst into tears in front of this painting by the master of French historical landscape, Claude Lorraine. And Turner painted this, an act of flattering homage so faithful that it's hard to tell them apart, at least at first. But Turner's originality was so great that he couldn't suppress it all the time. The most turbulent of all Turner's narrative pictures is also, I think, the masterpiece of the first part of his career. He painted Hannibal crossing the Alps in 1812. He was still operating in disguise, pretending again to be a rather grand history painter. But on this occasion the disguise is very thin. Turner does not seem terribly interested in Hannibal, his elephants and his army, who exist only as ant-sized creatures in a huge, disturbed vortex of paint. He's much more interested in the weather. Turner was asking himself the great questions of his time. Can beauty be won from a world ruled by violent change? Can catastrophe become an occasion not just for fear, but for insight? Eventually he would dive into this pool of light. but he would need a little encouragement before he dared to do so. During the second half of the 1820s, when Turner had just turned 50, he was often invited to this country house. We think of the great revolutions in world art as having happened, most of them, in great, romantic, famous places. Rome, Montmartre, New York. But this revolution took place almost without anyone noticing, here in a quiet corner in Sussex. Turner was invited to stay here at Petworth House by George O'Brien Wyndham, the flamboyant 3rd Earl of Egremont. The Earl possessed an extremely large income, most of which he spent on wine, women and art. At Petworth, he surrounded himself with paintings and sculptures. Unlike most of his peers, he had a lot of time for living British painters, especially Turner. He was probably the only person Turner knew who loved works of art almost as much as he did. And the son of a barber and the aristocrat struck up an unusually close friendship. Turner was given the old library with its clear north light to use as his studio. It's easier for some artists to do great things when they feel loved, and Turner was loved here. He found the space to play, to experiment, to try out new things. These watercolours are his diary of the daily life of the house, chatting by the fire, playing billiards. But they're much more than just that. Substance has come to interest Turner far less than colour. An unmade bed becomes an apparition of scarlet. An expansive wall becomes a gorgeous patch of yellow. At Petworth, Turner's evolution as a painter suddenly and marvellously accelerated. But the event which finally liberated him into the glorious freedoms of his late style took place in London. On the evening of the 16th of October 1834, the Houses of Parliament suddenly burst into flames. A huge crowd rushed to the riverside to watch the largest bonfire of the century, and Turner was among them. As soon as he got there, he rented a boat, and he went out into the middle of the river, and he produced these fantastically immediate sketches of the event. You can still almost feel the heat coming off them. I've looked at these watercolours many times, but each new time I'm still surprised by them. I think they're among the most exciting paintings in the world. No artist before Turner had ever captured the essence of fire as vividly as this, and they've never been surpassed. Once British art had been all but destroyed by the fires of the Reformation. But here, in a wonderful reversal of that, fire's been turned into some of the greatest British painting of all time. I think what Turner saw when he looked into those flames was the image of himself, his destiny as an artist. The fire that consumed the Houses of Parliament was Turner, because he was the fire that would devour the established order of art. There's no structure in fire, no order. Fire fascinated Turner because it was such a potent emblem of his conviction that change was the ruling principle of the world. He was constantly searching for the essence of things, the irreducible matter of the universe. Fire would become colour, and colour would become light. Of course, Turner wasn't the first artist to be fascinated by light. The subtle play of reflections in Vermeer's pictures gives them their quality of bewitched realism. Caravaggio spent his life exploring the drama of light and its potency as a symbol of religious revelation. But despite their differences, the great artists of the past, indeed all artists before Turner, shared one assumption. Light's function in their paintings was to model form. But in Turner, it's the other way round. In Turner, form exists to give reality to light. It's light that's real, form that's the inessential, the transitory, the insubstantial. This insight is what all Turner's earlier narrative pictures of destruction and apocalypse had been leading up to. Empires will fall, buildings will crumble, but light will always endure.
Turner's brilliance was only really understood by the French Impressionists. Monet was overwhelmed by Turner's paintings when he visited London in the early 1870s. And about 10 years later, Monet, Degas, Renoir, Pissarro, Boudin, and other leading Impressionists signed a joint statement acknowledging their debt.
"We have applied ourselves with passion," they wrote, "to the rendering of forms in movement and the fugitive phenomena of light. But we cannot forget that we have been preceded in this great path by the illustrious Monsieur Turner." But Monsieur Turner never got that message. He'd been dead for more than 30 years when they wrote their letter. In his own lifetime, the scorn that was poured on his most daring and radiant work was relentless.
"Turner paints pictures of nothing and very like. Looking at Mr. Turner's new works is no more edifying than staring at some old wall."
This is scribbling, not painting.
"This is madness."
He is a madman.
Turner's response to the barrage was to become a very private, even secretive person, and his biggest secret lay in the seaside town of Margate. When Turner was a child, he lived here for a while, and later in life he returned to paint. He'd board with a couple called the Booths in a house on the seafront.
In 1835, Mr. Booth died, and shortly afterwards Turner moved in with his young widow, Sophia. He persuaded her to come to London with him, and he bought her a house here in Chelsea. They were together for 17 years. But throughout that time, Turner kept their relationship completely secret. He even assumed a false identity while he was living with Sophia. He called himself Admiral Puggy Booth. For the rest of his life, he spent half his time as Mr. Turner, the noted Royal Academician, and the other half masquerading as a retired admiral of the fleet.
By hiding away from the oppressive gaze of his critics, by becoming Admiral Booth, Turner got back the space and freedom to experiment which he'd first found at Petworth. As Booth, no one could judge him. He could paint what and how he wanted. And that's what he did, in his very last and most incandescently brilliant works. This is the essence of Turner, his vision, purged finally and forever of story, anxiety and academy. Turner surpassed all his contemporaries because he combined the most remarkable qualities of each of them. He had Barry's determination to pursue a personal vision, no matter how much mockery or pain he might have to endure. He possessed Blake's revolutionary energy, his spirit of rebellion, and his determination to overthrow conventional ways of seeing and believing. Like John Constable, he was a tremendous innovator with the physical matter of paint itself. And from his friend John Soane, he got the idea that a man's work might be his own memorial, a monument to his life. Unlike Soane, Turner didn't build a museum to himself, but he trusted the British to do it for him. It took us more than a century to get round to building this annex to the Tate Gallery, but we did it in the end. On his death, Turner left the nation 19,331 of his works, saying, "Keep them together. For what use are they but together?" If I had to choose my own favourite, I think it'd be this miraculous late watercolour of a hotel bedroom in Venice. It's an endlessly fascinating picture, and within these few square inches of paper stained by coloured water, we can see, almost as if mapped out for later generations, the entire course of what we call modern art. There's the spatial freedom of Cubism, the colour and sensuality of Matisse, the imperious free geometry of Mondrian, the vastness and the sublimity of the finest abstract American painting of the 20th century. I still can't quite believe that Turner painted it in 1840. He wasn't just ahead of his time. He was light years ahead of his time. Just 2 years before Turner's death in 1851, a Frenchman, Armand Fizeau, arrived at the first accurate terrestrial measurement of the speed of light. I wonder if it's pure coincidence that Turner was painting in his late style, just when 19th century physics was on the verge of its own quantum leap. Turner sensed, by some subtle prescience, that it was above all in examining and pondering the phenomenon of light that mankind would come to ask the biggest questions. In the end, I think Turner realised that there were no answers to those questions. He saw the universe as a succession of inexplicable events, taking place in an indefinite void of uncertain origin. But his response was wonderfully simple. He set himself free. He became his own God. And Turner said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
The next programme in the series studies attitudes to art in the Victorian age, next Sunday at the later time of 7:30 here on BBC Two.